So we're here. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Harriet Gaffney, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, Keeping Them Honest, with authors Stephen Charles and Dr. Catherine Williams. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which their library services operate. They pay respect to Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders past, present and emerging, and they acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. I too acknowledge the Wadawurrung as the traditional owners of the land I reside on, and the Wadawurrung, Gadibalud and Gulajan of the Maar Nations, where I work, and I pay my respects to all First Nations people across Australia. Your sovereignty was never ceded. I'm very pleased to have been invited to facilitate tonight's event with Stephen and Catherine. Stephen Charles AOQC has a distinguished career at the Victorian Bar and as a Judge of Appeal in the Supreme Court of Victoria. He is a board member of the Accountable Roundtable and the Centre for Public Integrity. Dr. Catherine Williams is an adjunct research fellow in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe University, where she has lectured and tutored. She's also the research director of the Centre for Public Integrity. We have some brief housekeeping reminders before we begin our discussion. You can participate in this webinar by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your question or comment. You may need to touch your screen first to see the Q&A function pop up if you're using an iPad or an iPhone. You can submit your questions at any time throughout our discussion, and we'll do our very best to answer as many of those questions as possible for you. You can also vote on each other's questions, which will help us prioritise the questions that you're interested in having answered. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded. If you'd like to watch or listen to this discussion again, or recommend it to friends or family, it will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. Stephen and Catherine, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Harriet.
My pleasure. So firstly, let's begin. What a difference a fortnight makes. We have a new government in power and a strong crossbench, all of whom are focused on critical issues such as climate change and integrity in office. After what can only be described on reading your book and seeing the evidence laid out therein, as an acculturation of small and large actions of corruption at the level of the Commonwealth over the last 2 decades that has become normalised in Australian politics, most particularly, I would suggest, under the Morrison coalition government. A letter signed by 34 judges, including Sir Gerard Brennan AC and Mary Goodwin QC, to then Prime Minister Scott Morrison in December 2018, began, "Confidence and trust in government and public institutions is at an all-time low." Stephen, I'll begin with you because it really struck me when I was reading something, what I thought was, very interesting was that do Australian judges and legal scholars usually take such a public position, such as publishing a book on the need for a National Integrity Commission, on what are arguably political matters? What does it take for a judge to stand up and be heard on these topics?
Well, Harriet, that is absolutely right. Ordinarily, judges or retired judges don't engage in much public discussion about political matters at all. Now, this point is taken up by Sir Gerard Brennan, who writes the foreword and who says that there obviously has been, in the course of the last years, a very serious deterioration in matters of integrity in federal government. And that is reaching, in his view, a very serious stage. And he says that at this point, it now ceases to be something that judges should be silent about. Indeed, in his view, it's reached a point where judges should speak out about these matters.
Catherine, part of what Sir Gerard Brennan said there was about the social health, the way that corruption impacts the social health of communities and public trust in government. How would the formation of a National Integrity Commission help ensure the social health of the community and public trust in government? You know, they're both incredibly vital aspects of democracy. And how would a commission actually help to ensure that we can get those back?
It's a really important question, Harriet. So the formation of a National Integrity Commission, and of course, not just any National Integrity Commission, we're embarking on a period now where the real work starts to ensure that we end up with a genuine National Integrity Commission that's fit for purpose. But presuming that that's the model that we will end up with, let's be positive about it at the outset, it will play a vital role in beginning to restore public trust in public administration. Because what we know from research by the OECD is that one of the key drivers of social cohesion is public trust, which is based on our ability to have confidence in the fact that decisions are being made for the public interest, not for private interest. And a National Integrity Commission would play a vital role in uncovering, exposing cases where that has not happened, and in deterring that. It would play a really important educative and deterrent function also. So that's how it would begin to play the role. Now, we would not say that it's a panacea. There's a whole framework of integrity reform that is also required, but it is absolutely a critically important step that we can be very, very pleased we're now properly on the road towards.
Yeah, I'll take up that point with you, Stephen. You state in the book that the primary aim of an anti-corruption body is not actually to obtain convictions for criminal conduct. Yes. It's to uncover serious corruption in the field of public administration and to expose it publicly. Yes. Before we begin to look at any specific examples of egregious conduct, we know that I think it was in 2020 that the Morrison federal government put forward an exposure draft for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. How did that stack up? You know, going back to that point that Catherine made in regards to the rigour of a National Integrity Commission. So how did that exposure draft stack up in terms of what it could actually achieve?
Half of that exposure draft relates to law enforcement bodies like the Australian Federal Police, the Border Force, the Tax Office, that sort of thing. That half stacks up very well. It's got a broad definition of corruption. It talks about corruption of any other kind. Anyone can complain to the body. Once an investigation about something which merely has to be significant to enable the examination to start, once it's begun, most hearings must be in public in that body. And once it's arrived at a view, then the report at the end can include findings of corrupt conduct. So that's all fine. That's pretty much along the line of what we say should happen. Mm-hmm. But then you come to the other half of the Christian Porter draft. That part has a very narrow definition of corruption, because you've got to find a reasonable suspicion of one of a number of mentioned crimes. And that's the first point. A lot of misconduct does not amount to a crime. A lot of corruption doesn't amount to a crime. And then, so that, and I'll come to why, if you want to talk about that in relation to things like the sports shorts, no one can complain directly in relation to that part of the Porter draft, and particularly in relation to politicians. Any person who's got a complaint that they want to make has to make it to a body like the Australian Federal Police and persuade them that there is a reasonable suspicion of a crime of one kind or another. Now, assuming that you've succeeded in getting that far, there won't be any public hearings at all. And if there is to be a report at the end, and what is contemplated by the Christian Porter draft is that if at the end of an investigation in relation to politicians say, that they take the view that there may be a reasonable case of a crime, that is then to be referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions for consideration of prosecution, so that any matter that follows that line wouldn't become public until a prosecution is actually laid in a courtroom, which could be many months after the investigation. Insofar as there is a report, it may not, in relation to politicians, even contain an implied criticism of a politician, which shows you how little in the way of exposure you would get under that part.
So I'll jump to the need for public hearings, and we will come back and discuss in greater detail some of those sort of most blatant issues of corruption in government over the last few years. But jumping to the issue of public hearings, why is it, polling shows that over 70% of Australians want a federal corruption commission that holds public hearings. And in fact, I was reading something today that looked at, I think, 90 seats so far out of those that have been counted. In terms of the election, 90 of those seats were strongly behind the idea for a National Integrity Commission. So polling shows that over 70% of Australians want a federal corruption. And in fact, something else I read today as I was, getting myself up to speed for this was that it seems that when they look at the trends in terms of the latest federal election, it actually doesn't seem as though pork barrelling influenced votes that strongly, so that to me speaks to how the Australian people are feeling about the things that have gone on in government. So the need for public hearings, why is it so important, or why is it vital for the success of an integrity commission that those hearings are held in public? Catherine, perhaps you might take that up.
Okay, public hearings really cover a number of different purposes. One of them is the purpose of a body of this kind is to expose misconduct, or if we're talking about corruption, that to the public. Now, if you are going to wait until something actually reaches a courtroom, that may be many months after an investigation has started. The best example of it is the investigation that the IBAC undertook in relation to the Education Department, which
here in Victoria.
In Victoria. And that was the first major investigation undertaken by IBAC. It demonstrated to the public for the first time that there was serious corruption in Victoria at very high levels of the Education Department. Secondly, while the public hearings were actually taking place, the Education Department changed all its rules and procedures so that that sort of thing could never happen again. It brings home to the public service what is wrong with corruption. It brings home to the public what corruption looks like, appears like. It resulted in a whole swig of complaints being made to IBAC about other types of corruption. And of course, there is the deterrent factor.
Catherine, I'll come back to you on in regards to, you mentioned that the public service, Stephen, in relation to public hearings and how exposure, particularly in Victoria, and in the case in Victoria with the Education Department, how exposure actually made them rigorously look at themselves and how they were behaving. Catherine, does that come back to this issue of social, the health of the community, the social health of the community, and how, what we need to know in terms of how we can make decisions? And how do we, so you mentioned before electoral reform. We need wider electoral reform than a National Integrity Commission. What other, sort of reforms would you be advocating for to ensure that, yes, this exposure will help departments, perhaps look at what's going on, but what else do we need to sort of bolster that?
That's another excellent question, and there are many reforms that we need. I suppose a good category to talk about in terms of giving the public confidence in the fact that decisions are being made in their interest rather than private interest, is reform directed at eliminating undue influence. So when I'm talking about undue influence, I'm talking in particular about influence that people with substantial wealth are able to buy. And they are able to buy that influence at the moment at the federal level through donations, because we have a situation where at the federal level, and the federal level really is the jurisdiction in Australia that stands out for this failure, where there is no proper regulation of donations. So we have a current disclosure threshold. It's indexed annually, but currently the disclosure threshold stands at $14,500. So you can donate $14,499 and not need to disclose the donation. Now, what on earth could possibly be the justification for such a high donations disclosure threshold? That's an easy one to remedy. You just pull it down to, a few $1,000s probably is appropriate. In Victoria, for example, we do have this kind of threshold, and we also have a donations cap, which is another thing lacking at the federal level. So one, we want the donations disclosed, and two, we actually want them capped, because as I said, here in Victoria, we have a cap where you're not allowed to donate. One person or an organisation can't donate to the same recipient any more than about $4,200 in an election in a 4-year period. So that way, if you know that that's the maximum amount that can be donated, you know that it is an amount that there is a reasonable proportion of the community of which could afford to make that donation. It's not something that can only be achieved by a very elite section of the population. So it means that we can be more sure that people with wealth aren't able to buy access because of their ability to make substantial donations.
So it's 14,500. I mean, in some ways, in this day and age, I mean, I don't have $14,500 to donate to anyone.
Nor do I, Harriet.
But it doesn't actually feel like in a level of sort of federal politics, $14,500 doesn't actually feel that much. However, is it 14,500 in total, or is that just to one member? Can you split your money? Can you be throwing $14,500 in multiple directions?
You can donate it to. You can't donate more than $14,500 to any one single recipient. So you could donate it to all your favoured candidates if you wanted to do that, and that would be acceptable. And there are some, if we look at the Commonwealth, the federal parties and their corporate donors, we see situations where some corporate donors they seem to hedge their bets, and they often couch this in the language of supporting democratic engagement because they donate equally to both sides. And then there are others that are more clearly ideologically aligned, and they only ever make donations in one particular direction, regardless of who is in government. So yes, people take different approaches to how they direct those donations, but you can direct them to numerous parties, yes.
I'm just reading, we have a question. I'm actually going to throw out my script, and I'm going to bring this question in now, if that's okay, and then I'll come back to my own script. So this is a question from Heather de Cruz, and she says, I fully support a strong federal crime and corruption commission, but what is to prevent the commission being used for political point scoring or going after enemies? That sort of reminds me a little bit of one of my questions, like after having read the book and having seen the extraordinary amounts of money that have changed hands, and been expended on the car parks rorts, the sports rorts, there's a whole list of things which just make you shudder. How are we, how do we know? And so how do we stop people going after enemies? But I'd also like to know, can we get justice for things that have occurred?
When a body of this kind is set up, suppose, let's say at the end of this year, it's established and ready to operate January the 1st next year, it will receive thousands of complaints immediately, thousands. And of those thousands, possibly 0.1% will be serious and will be pursued. And the question is going to be, can be answered in two ways. First, when a complaint is received, it will be received in absolute secrecy, so that the fact that a complaint has been made should not ever be made public, and anyone who does make it public will be committing a serious offence, and hopefully could meet all the full force of the law. Secondly, it will depend upon the absolute non-partisanship of the people that you put in place as the commissioner, the deputy commissioners, and the staff of the commission. It's critical that they be absolutely non-partisan and beyond reproach. And if that is so, they will be looking not for things that are going to provide an easy way of making trouble for the party in power or for the opposition. They'll be looking at what is a genuine case, or what seems to them a genuine case of something going seriously wrong. And then it won't become public until they decide that the time for a public hearing has arrived. And the no matter will start immediately with a public hearing. What will happen is that there will be long periods when secret investigations are taking place, in camera hearings, matters of that kind, until the body has got a pretty good idea of what is going on and whether something seriously corrupt or otherwise, or misconduct is involved, and then decide that it's in the public interest to have a public hearing.
So, Stephen, tell us then, so, you know, you mentioned, for example, the reform of the Department of Education in Victoria after Operation Ord. What other successful corruption mitigation have we seen as a result of public hearings in Australia, but either at the state or well, obviously not the federal level, but at the state level? Well, and who does it well?
Well, at the state level, they've had now, I think, 9 public hearings, but they've had a very large number of investigations that were never made public. And if you look at the reports of IBAC, which are made each year, they set out in those reports a number of cases where they've pursued to the end claims that have been, complaints that have been made, and in which they have arrived at a result. Much more is known about what's happened in ICAC in Sydney, because ICAC had a great deal of corruption, particularly in the municipal area, and donations made by builders or those who wanted buildings put up for them, and who were trying by corrupt means to get approvals for them and matters of that kind. There's been a great deal of success achieved there, and a number of premiers of New South Wales have very publicly thanked ICAC for the work it's done.
I'm just, of course, thinking about Gladys Berejiklian at this point in time. And, you know, I mean, obviously we know that former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, you know, was very seen large and loud speaking about the fact that that was a kangaroo court, etc. What do you know, what would you say to that?
Okay, Catherine, do you want to answer?
Yes, with great pleasure. Look, it's difficult to know where to begin in response to that comment. I mean, it just smacked of a real misunderstanding, a fundamental misapprehension of the role of an integrity commission, and a real lack of respect for one state, the state from which, of course, our former Prime Minister came, one of their most important accountability institutions. I thought it was a shocking comment. And the integrity commissions are not courts. It's really important to bear that in mind. They don't have the function of determining criminal guilt. They're not set up for that purpose. They don't want, that's not their objective at all. So I guess that's the first thing that I would say about that. Now, then, in respect of that the use of that description to describe ICAC's role in relation to Gladys Berejiklian, it needs to be borne in mind that what ICAC was looking at in relation to Gladys Berejiklian was a very serious accusation. We're speaking about the misuse of a substantial amount of public money. That's taxpayer money, and it's not an infinite pot of money, that one. So we need to ensure that it's put towards proper purposes. And so therefore any allegation of misuse deserves to be investigated. That one was, frequently the narrative was around a wronged woman who had been taken advantage of, etc. But ICAC was looking at a very, very different issue.
Yes, indeed. And that reminds me, of course, of, our treatment of, asylum seekers and refugees on Nauru and Manus, and the corruption, that behind the awarding of that contract. Would either of you, care to speak on that issue?
Catherine?
The awarding of those contracts is an important question. And look, this is without, I suppose, speaking in detail about either of those cases, that those kind of situations are reasons for which we need those strong donations laws that we were talking about earlier. They're also reasons that we need much better lobbying regulation, because you're talking now about contracts, so we start looking at procurement, and when we start looking at procurement, we start really getting the involvement of lobbyists. And what we have at the moment at the federal level is an exceptionally lax lobbying regime. We've even had the Auditor General calling it a light touch approach. And the Auditor General is calling it a light touch approach for a couple of key reasons. One is that the regime inexplicably only applies to third-party lobbyists. So it doesn't apply to lobbyists who are paid within firms to go out and lobby for the firm to win contracts, only for third-party lobbyists. Then also there's a very short post-employment separation period of 12 months to 18 months, whereas the strong jurisdictions on these points have periods of 2 to 5 years in place. Then when we come to determining the strength of the federal lobbying regime, we also start to look at what the consequences are for breach of the regime. And at a federal level, the consequence is deregistration. It's hardly an effective deterrent. So what we'd be wanting to see in order to ensure that when substantial contracts are allocated, they're allocated appropriately. One, we need better disclosure of and cap donations. Two, we need better regulation of lobbying. And then three, we need to really look at our Commonwealth procurement rules, which is some delegated legislation that governs the way in which Commonwealth procurements are managed. We need to ensure that actually those rules apply to a much broader range of procurements than the range they currently apply to, and can't so easily be exempted in the way that they're able to be exempted at the moment.
I mean, it was phenomenal, enormous amounts of money awarded without a tender, and and repeatedly. And we know, like, I was sort of gobsmacked that yes, we're still paying this company this extraordinary amount of money, and there's no asylum seekers or refugees on Nauru anymore.
And so we deserve to know why, given it's our money. We deserve to know where it's going, the use to what it's to use, the use to which it's being put. And there's a really important bit of legislation called the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act. And that Act, Section 71 of that Act specifically requires that before a minister approves any expenditure of public money, they make reasonable inquiries to ensure that that expenditure is a proper use of public funds. And the Act tells us that a proper use of public funds is a use that is efficient, effective, economical and ethical. Now, how can the kind of funds use that you're talking about be shown to meet that threshold.
Absolutely.
We have no evidence to enable us to be confident that that requirement has been met in this case. And it's a real problem. We really need to bolster the transparency requirements around expenditure so that we can see why money is being spent the way it is.
Oh, yeah, so of course that can, sort of doesn't lead neatly, but it takes me back to the car park rorts. The sports rorts pale in comparison. $660 million in car parks, more than half of the scheme's 47 projects allocated the day before Prime Minister Morrison called the 2019 federal election, and every one of the projects in vulnerable electorates. But what really sort of I found gobsmacking was that I was stunned to read that in response to a request for evidence of authority to select the car park sites, the Prime Minister's office provided a copy of a press release that advised there is a precedent established by the Department for the Prime Minister and Cabinet that a media announcement by the Prime Minister, I'm going to repeat that a media announcement by the Prime Minister constitutes relevant authority to progress a project.
And that goes back to exactly where those activities, both the sports rorts and the car park rorts, while they're a form of pork barrelling, if you want to grade pork barrelling into where it becomes serious misconduct, pork barrelling is part of what took place in Parliament when Josh Frydenberg produced a budget which was directed to try and get people to vote for the coalition. And likewise, when the opposition came forward with their budget speeches, they were doing something of the same. The sports rorts and the car park rorts were of a quite different character, because in both cases you had no proper investigation of whether these sports grants that were being promised were needed, and what the Auditor General found was that they were being made on an entirely improper basis of trying to shore up marginal seats in favour of the coalition. That got a stage worse with the car parks, because the way in which they were obtained was by either candidates standing for election or members who were standing for re-election simply rang up the office and said, look, we're in a bit of difficulty in my electorate, I'd like some car parks. And the result of that was that Josh Frydenberg in Kooyong got 4 car parks, which would have been $65 million worth, and Tim Wilson in Goldstein got 6. And in neither case had there been any proper examination of whether they were needed or where they were needed. It was simply to make it possible for them to go to their electorate and say, look what I've been able to get you and what this coalition will be able to get you if you re-elect us.
It's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, I feel like prior to sort of, 2000, maybe, 2013 or something, that we did have some sense of it was a shameful thing to do, and it wasn't the usual, it wasn't usual behaviour, and it was something that was frowned upon. And yet by the end of the coalition's current reign, we got to a stage whereby one, we were being told that the Prime Minister had authority to, do whatever he liked, basically, and that, by releasing a press release, that was, sufficient authority. And 2, that, this was part and parcel of everyday politics.
But this was one reason why the Prime Minister was coming out with that disgraceful performance in Parliament, calling ICAC a kangaroo court. Because when the Auditor General disclosed to the public the first time that the sports rorts had taken place, so that something like 500,000 was going to Tony Abbott's electorate, Warringah, for the Mosman Rowing Club to improve their pontoons. Now, there were the need there is a little difficult to see, Now, when the Prime Minister went to the National Press Club lunch, shortly after the Auditor General's report came out, there were 8 or 9 journalists waiting there to ask him questions about how could this possibly be justified. One after another, he treated their questions with arrogant disdain and a complete lack of any sense of an awareness of the wrong that he was doing. And when he saw what was happening in relation to ICAC, I think he saw himself called up in a public hearing and being forced to answer questions by counsel in relation to that. And he fully justified being worried about a hearing of that kind.
You certainly do when you're reading the book and you just see the pile upon pile up, one thing after another of this sort of reprehensible conduct on multiple levels. You really do, you know, that's where I was going about halfway through the book, was they must have been terrified to lose government, because it can be, you know, if we get the sort of National Integrity Commission that we want and that, you know, the National Integrity Committee is advocating for, it, you know, so much can be exposed and will be exposed.
Combination of a complete disregard for the rule of law, as the evidence before the Senate hearings showed, and it's an assault on democracy, where you are attempting to entrench in power and a bad and unpopular government, giving a lot of money to a small number of marginal seats to entrench itself in power.
Yes, and we know that, I mean, in many ways, I feel like Australia sort of has led the world backwards in a few issues, you know, including our treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. And now we're seeing Britain sort of, you know, look to, well, they are just about to enforce the same sort of offshore policies. But this whistling away at the foundation of democracy, we're not just seeing it here, are we, Catherine?
No, look, you're absolutely right. And I guess I want to pick up the point, Harriet, because you referred to our treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. And in the context of our discussion, that brings to my mind the issue of appointments, and in particular appointments to the AAT, because we have seen a slew of appointments to the AAT that are politicised appointments. And I guess my view on it is that now the independence of that tribunal has been compromised to such a significant extent that it'd probably be better to do away with it and start again. And start again with a new tribunal that is governed by a statute that has really robust appointment processes in place, so that we can be certain that those who are reviewing the merits of Commonwealth administrative decisions are actually independent and are not politically aligned, and also, critically importantly, are legally qualified to be doing so. It's you know, staggering. Currently, the AAT Act contains a provision that requires the president to be someone who's qualified to be a judge of a Supreme or federal court. But members of the AAT can be legally qualified, but aren't required to be so if the Governor-General believes they have some other skill, on the advice of the minister, obviously, has some other skill that makes them suitable for the appointment. Now, members will inevitably encounter complex legislative material in that role. Without, at a minimum, a legal qualification, you're simply not competent to do that. So we need to ensure that ideally in a new body, all appointees at a minimum are legally qualified. And you could have, you know, there's some really innovative ideas about how you could ensure that appointments are independent. One really interesting idea, it was actually an interesting idea that was considered in Victoria, or I think suggested by the Department of Justice in Victoria back when VCAT was being established. You could have they called it a Victorian Tribunal Council that would be set up to play the role of shortlister of applicants and interviewer of applicants, and ultimately who would make a recommendation to the Victorian Attorney General that would be binding on who appropriate appointees would be. And if we could get at a federal level something like that in place in relation to either the AAT or a new tribunal, so that we could be confident in the fact that members are properly independent, that'd be a really, really excellent thing.
We've had a question from Terry Bradford. He's asking, the next question really is, so if an integrity commission is established, what powers would you suggest that it have, and what enforcement policy would it need?
It would have all the powers of a royal commission. In other words, it's a branch of the executive, just as the coalition was able to set up the Hayne Commission to investigate the banking industry. It would be able to call witnesses up to the level of the Prime Minister and require them to give evidence on oath in which they would not have the ability to refuse to answer questions on the grounds that they would incriminate them. It would so it would be able to force people to give evidence. It would be able to probably to decide, depending on the way the Act is set up, whether to hold public hearings or not, and it would be able to report at the end. Now, the question is, what enforcement powers would it have? It's not a branch of the judiciary, so it would have no enforcement powers at all. Most royal commissions cannot prosecute. They can make a report on the basis of which the local DPP makes a decision whether there is a basis for prosecution or not. The object of an integrity commission is simply to investigate and expose misconduct.
Yes, that's right. And because that, of course, is vital for the health of democracy, as you make clear. It's all very big, isn't it? It's so, there's so many layers to it. I mean, I must say, I do feel I was a little bit concerned when I was asked to facilitate this event, because I was a bit worried. I was quite worried after the 2019 election that we would see the same government returned. And I think it would have been quite a different discussion had we. I think that we do all now have some hope. Keep our fingers crossed. So let's talk about, we've talked about other sort of reforms, etc., that we would need in regards to electoral laws, political finance, donations, etc. What about the public service? We haven't really talked about the public service and its role in terms of safeguarding democracy, and indeed the way perhaps that the public service became more of a political, was used perhaps or mechanised as a political arm of government over the last several election cycles. I know I'm happy for either of you to take that up.
I guess the comment that I would make about the public service, one, I agree with you entirely in respect of what you're saying has happened to the public service, and what we would want to see is the public service returned to a position from which it is able to provide frank and fearless advice. And so we had in 2019, we had the review of the public service led by David Thodey, and he made many recommendations, and the former government accepted some of those recommendations in full, some of those recommendations in part, but it didn't deal with some really important recommendations. To give you just one example of an important recommendation that it didn't adopt the recommendation in respect of secretary's tenure. So the review was saying that there should be very few circumstances in which agency heads should be able to have their positions terminated. And the reason for that, I think, is self-evident. You want to know, you want agency heads to know that their employment is secure so that they feel confident in providing frank and fearless advice. And that recommendation was not adopted. We would really like to see that recommendation adopted, as well as the Australian Public Service Commissioners powers, say, in relation to own motion investigations strengthened. So there are a couple of outstanding recommendations from that review that would be a really good starting point when it comes to returning the public service to its proper place in Australian public administration.
What Mr. Morrison made perfectly clear is that his government wanted to control the public service. It didn't want frank and fearless advice. Thank you very much. And that was why the 30 panel's recommendations were not brought into effect in full.
Yes, I mean, so it was interesting, wasn't it, to see one of the first acts of new Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to actually sack the head of the head of the Prime Minister's office and cabinet, Mr. Gaetjens. What hope do you have now that we've just learned about the who is going to be the next? What does it augur for the health of the Commonwealth public sector that Albanese has just announced the University of Melbourne's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Glyn Davis, as the head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet?
It is terrific.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
An outstanding appointment.
Yeah, but he has been very publicly pointing to the failure of Mr. Morrison's government to give effect to the 30 panel's recommendations. He was a member of the 30 panel, which, among other things, strongly supported the creation of an integrity commission.
And what else do you think that we can expect, or have you had any inklings as to what we could expect from the Albanese Labor government in regards to where we're moving? You know, I mean, that was obviously very, likewise, I was very delighted to hear about that appointment, but any other things that you know, give you hope?
Well, if they are going to set up an integrity commission, as they have promised, what they are going to have to do is govern properly. In other words, when the time comes to offer a contract or something of that kind, they won't be able to simply make a closed tender process so that only one person, that one of their favourite people, is able to get the tender. They are going to have to give people a fair opportunity of making offers for the relevant contract, and they're going to have to be considered on their merits. If they go back to the way in which the Morrison government regularly acted, as we've seen, then hopefully this body will catch them out.
I'm going to throw back to some of the questions that we're getting from our audience. Heather De Cruz says, would it be very difficult or controversial to abolish the current AAT and re-establish an improved body as described? And she talks about the risks of Murdoch media representing this posed problems. I mean, we haven't even mentioned Murdoch and his influence on democracy across the world.
It's probably, look, it can be achieved by the passage of legislation. The AAT is established under a governing statute, and it could ease, in the sense of that the passage of legislation might be an easy thing. Its abolition could be achieved via that and the concurrent establishment of a new body. Might it be a controversial thing? I suppose in some quarters, and specifically in the nominated quarters, it well might be that. But there would be a really substantial benefit to be gained. And that is, again, to return to your initial point, Harriet, which is public trust. We need the public to have confidence in the fact that those who are reviewing Commonwealth administrative decisions are appropriately qualified and appropriately independent. Now, tribunal members need to also, if there's this dual aspect of independence, then that people need to be independent, but they need to be seen to be independent also. And at the moment, the public isn't seeing them to be independent. I think with at least some appointments, you could probably say that the public might have a reasonable apprehension of bias in certain tribunal members' decisions. And therefore, the benefit to be gained from taking remedial action is so significant that I think it would outweigh concerns about it being difficult or controversial.
I've got another. So Terry asked us a question before, and so he's going on from there, but unfortunately we've gone to other places. So I'm going to read this question out. He says, so what's to stop the process going through, he or she, I'm sorry, that was, so what's to stop the process going through to the next stage and being knocked back or carried through? Now,
well, there's a warning there from what happened with Ted Baillieu when he became Premier in 2011 in Victoria, having promised to set up an integrity commission modelled on the New South Wales ICAC. Now, that is sort of written on my heart like Calais, because I was the chair of the panel that advised the Baillieu government how to set up the IBAC. What happened was the ministerial aides got to the Baillieu government and told them, if you set up a proper integrity commission, it will bite you first. The result was that when the IBAC was first set up, it was a hopeless paper tiger. Now, if the ministerial aides to the new Albanese government get to work and say, for God's sake, it's going to get you, then there may be backsliding. We'll have to watch out for. At the moment, they're showing every sign of being determined to keep their promise to the full, and let's hope they do that.
yes.
And if they do, then it ought to be set up. It's going to be quite a job to do it this year, as they've promised, because there are a number of difficult questions to work out. The form of it is going to have to depend upon looking at all states now have bodies of this kind. All of them have different forms of legislation. They're going to have to work out which form on, for example, public hearings is the best. And the way in which each state differs with those differs very dramatically. Now, there'll be people who say, well, all hearings shouldn't be public, only very few. There is damage to reputations, and what are we going to do about it? So there are a number of difficult questions they're going to have to work out.
Another question from Terry. He says, I'm just a little concerned with the selection criteria or criteria being widely interpreted as a former government employee who's witnessed cases of that. So I suppose that comes to the question of what, in our last few minutes, we've got about 5 minutes left, what makes, what is the model that you would pursue? What do you think is what is needed to ensure that we can get as much sort of integrity sort of back into our democratic process?
That the selection of people would have to be done by a non-partisan parliamentary committee in which the government did not have a majority.
And Catherine, to you, from, can you give us a brief summation of what should this National Integrity Commission look like? Yeah.
So as well as the appointment point, which Stephen makes very importantly, we need to see that it has secure funding, so it's not vulnerable to political attack through being rendered ineffective via funding reductions, which is of course what happened to the Auditor General for a period. Funding was slashed. It seemed as punishment almost for the reports it was releasing. We need to ensure that the jurisdiction of the Commission is sufficiently broad so that it's able to look at broadly defined corrupt conduct, that it is able to ensure that it's able to have the necessary investigative powers that Stephen has referred to, being the powers of a royal commission, that it can hold public hearings in appropriate circumstances, that it can report publicly, and it does need to be that transparent reporting regime, both through the Parliament and also to individuals concerned. When there have only been private investigations, never a public hearing, then you'd have reporting to the individuals concerned rather than to the public. And Stephen referred to a really important element in all of this, which is the establishment of a cross-party parliamentary committee that would be responsible, you know, as we see it, that committee would be responsible for appointments, and it could have an important role to play in funding recommendations that could be binding or non-binding, also an important oversight role. There would be an inspectorate to oversee the Commission's functions also. That's an important protection to have in place. And Stephen referred also to the need for complaints to be able to be made by members of the public, by whistleblowers to the Commission. We need the Commission to be able to act on its own initiative when it sees reasons to do so. So when we're talking about a fit for purpose integrity commission, those are the key elements that we really want to see put in place.
The jurisdiction is particularly important because if you have what the Christian Porter model suggested federally for politicians, that required you to be able to have a reasonable suspicion of a crime. Now, if you were wanting to look at the sports rules, for example, when everyone learnt that Senator Bridget McKenzie was making grants of X dollars to A and a number of other dollars to Y and the rest of it, there was at that point no suspicion of any crime at all. And there would be no basis for starting an investigation. You couldn't have started an investigation at all until the Auditor General's report actually came out. And you learnt for the first time that there had been great misconduct involved in all the money going into marginal electorates. Until that happened, there was no basis to start. And if anyone had tried to start an investigation, people could have moved into the federal court and to get an injunction to stop the investigation going ahead. Because that's the other protection that you need, which is the whole of the operations of the Commission to be supervised by the federal court.
We've got one last question from our audience before we wrap up tonight. Nola Rabe asks, if or when an Integrity Commission is established, I'm interested in this too, how far back in time will such a body be able to investigate potential corruption? What time frame is appropriate?
Look, I don't think you don't legislate the time frame. So you just ensure that the Commission, that the legislation establishing the Commission applies retrospectively, just broadly applies retrospectively. And then it would be a matter for the Commission to determine, because it's going to be looking at whether it's in the public interest to pursue an investigation. And that's when the question about time frame would become relevant. So it would be for the Commission to determine the point at which something is so far in the past that is no longer relevant, but you don't want to be setting up a specific time frame within the legislation itself.
You can't alter the law retrospectively, so that something which was not criminal then can suddenly become criminal. You simply can't do that. If you are looking, for example, at something like a contract to provide guards for Manus Island or Nauru, which is still in force, then it would be a matter for the Commission to decide whether it wanted to investigate these things. But if you've got a contract like that made, say, 4 or 5 years ago, but which was still in force, then it might well take the view that it was entirely proper to look at it. So retrospectivity is not a problem. It can do that. But the real question is whether there is a point to doing so.
Look, we could go on talking for hours. I think, of course, that's bringing to mind is Timor-Leste and, Witness K, etc., etc. But we are just now out of time. I don't think we have any more questions from the audience. So I'm going to say thank you so much, Stephen and Catherine, for such an insightful discussion, and also for, just working so hard against the odds last year to put this down for the Australian public to have access to and to think about the state of our democracy. It's, I was already unhappy at it, but now I have a much better insight into actually the levels of it. It's not just one party doing it. It's, it's across all parties, it's state and federal, and I'm sure at the local government level too. So these are really important questions for us. Keeping Them Honest, our audience, Keeping Them Honest is published by Scribe, and it's available to borrow from Geelong Regional Libraries. And you can also purchase a copy of the book from local bookstores, and I believe that the link has been posted in the chat. Catherine, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Harriet, for having us. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
And Stephen, thank you. It was wonderful to meet you and to have your incredible experience and expertise in this space.
Thank you indeed.
Everyone, on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.